Good morning, everyone. My name is Nina Privoz, and I'll be moderating today's lecture, which is the second event from the festival History on the Edge. I am very happy to introduce you to our first Erasmus Plus trainee, Ivana Mihaela Žimbrek, who is a PhD candidate at the Central European University, Budapest, Vienna, at the Department of History, where she's working on her PhD thesis on the history of department store in Socialist Yugoslavia. She's exploring how different expert communities planned the modernization of retail and urban space under the Yugoslav self-managed socialism from the 1950s to the late 1980s. Today she will represent her lecture with the title Women's Organizations, Home Economics and the Beginning of Modern Retail in Socialist Yugoslavia, 1950s to 1960s. Ivana, please, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Nina, so much. So hi, everyone, welcome. First of all, I would just like to thank the Institute and everyone in the Institute for giving me the opportunity to spend a few months here to do my research, and for also giving me the opportunity to be able to present this research here today. So as Nina said, the title of my presentation today is Women's Organizations, Home Economics and the Beginnings of Modern Retail in Socialist Yugoslavia in the 1950s and the 1960s. And this research forms a part of my dissertation project, in which I want to explore the development of department stores in Socialist Yugoslavia as a kind of way to investigate the interconnection between modernization of retail and transformations of urban space under Yugoslav self-managed state socialism from the 50s to the late 80s. And in my dissertation, I placed the focus on the activities and discourses of experts in different expert communities. So in retailing, in trade, architecture, urban planning, and local government. And I want to see how these experts, through different department store chains and other Yugoslav and international organizations, planned and imagined the modernization of retail and retail network in urban areas, which they saw as important elements in the physical, economic, and social development of Yugoslav state socialism. And in the first few chapters of the dissertation, I deal with the decades of the 1950s and the 1960s, because I think this is the period of the kind of first phase of modernization of retail and emergence of modern retail spaces. But since I also focused on experts, I think there's also a parallel process of basically the emergence of first experts and production of first expert knowledge on the topic. And I want to start the story of Yugoslav department stores by focusing on Yugoslav women or on the members of Yugoslav women's organizations, because I think they played an important role in this early phase of development of retail and retail spaces. And I kind of want to argue that that members of Yugoslav women's organizations served as both activists and experts in these first phases of modernization of retail. They were active on different expert levels of exchange, so on federal, republic, but also in international levels, and they produced, disseminated, and exchanged various genres of knowledge production, such as exhibitions, conferences, publications, and seminars. So they were actively involved in both establishing the fields of expertise and their object of study. So I want to show in this presentation how they were active in producing expert knowledge, raising public awareness, and insisting on interdisciplinary and inter-organizational collaboration. And this was crucial for setting the foundations for the establishment of a spectrum of welfare and commercial services and facilities, including modern retail. And for me, I think when we study retail, this is important because framing women as experts and activists sort of moves the analysis beyond the usual dichotomy between male experts and female workers in retailing, and it shows how women were also involved both directly and indirectly in a different way when we speak about modernization of retail. So this is the roadmap to my presentation today. So these are the topics that I will talk about. So I will start with saying a bit more about what Yugoslav women's organizations did in the 1950s and the 1960s, because this is still a sort of under-researched topic in historiography. And I will particularly focus on the interest of these organizations on modernizing household work and resolving the so-called issue of the double burden. And here, home economics is another important topic because it represents the kind of main scientific framework within which these organizations try to form different practices and institutions for resolving the issue of the double burden. And modern retail based on the self-service system. So the supermarket system is important because modernization of retail presented one of the solutions for, in general, modernizing household work, and retail sector was relevant for women both as workers in the retail system, but also for women as consumers. And here we need to think about consumption not simply as a leisure activity, but actually as a part of household work, which also needs to be modernized in this bigger scheme. So during the 1950s and early 1960s, women's organizations organized exhibitions, discussions, publications on topics related to modernizing household work, improving lives of women and families, and rising the living standard. And at the same time, I want to show how this also contributed to the development of social self-management as self-governing of Yugoslav citizens outside of the workplace. So how basically these three topics were connected to each other. So the 1950s and the 1960s, as you probably already know, were characterized by a very intense urbanization, growth of industrial urban centers. So there was a wave of mass rural-urban migrations. Women moved from the countryside, and at the same time, this industrialization, urbanization increased the need for entry of women into wage labor. And these new circumstances of wage employment in growing urban centers, on the one hand, sort of induced a significant transformation of the economic and social status of Yugoslav women, but at the same time, it caused, according to the women's organization, a severe conflict between, on the one hand, women's paid labor, and on the other hand, unpaid household work. So on the one hand, we have a kind of intense development of these workplaces, but not of the home. And basically, the women's organizations already from the late 1940s, so starting with the Anti-Fascist Women's Front, they address this kind of intertwined role of women in, building socialism. So as a kind of, what role did women play in a far-reaching effort of economic and social improvement on the one hand, but then on the other hand, also this necessity to modernize household and improve and change the role of women in the domestic sphere. So the Anti-Fascist Women Front was already after the war active in organizing domestic courses, and engaging in improving household technologies. So they were already focusing on the domestic sphere. And the reason for this is they in general played a big role in this massive post-war reconstructions. And according to some scholars, and I would agree with this, you can also see how women's organizations, so how the Anti-Fascist Women Front in a way provided a full replacement of social services in this period where they were still being reconstructed after the war. And as things changed, so during the mid-50s and early 60s, they kind of moved towards being a leading actor in a network of social organizations which focus primarily on the living standard and the social status of women. Another important change which directly affects the structure of women's organization was the introduction of the self-management system, decentralization, and the empowerment of housing communities, and the empowerment of the role of housing communities, and this increased the pressure on the Anti-Fascist Women Front to structurally transform. And after the Popular Front itself was remodeled into the Socialist Alliance of Working People in 1953, the organization also dissolves, and in its place comes the so-called League of Women's Association of Yugoslavia as a loosely connected and decentralized alliance of women's organizations that exist on different republic, county, and city levels. And they exist, this is important, under the umbrella of the Socialist Alliance of the Working People. And the focus of the Socialist Alliance of the Working People in this period, it switches also from mass action to social self-management and housing communities. And this is how, what I've mentioned before, how the social self-management is here connected. So by the end of the 1950s, the Yugoslav women's organizations recognized that the issues that were plaguing the life of Yugoslav women, and for them it was primarily centered around this issue of the household, they saw these women's problem as broader social problems, and they were kind of advocating for collaboration between different social organizations headed by the Socialist Alliance of the Working People to work on resolving this problem. And in 1961, the League of Women's Associations of Yugoslavia again changes its name in an attempt to kind of integrate more into the Socialist Alliance, and it becomes the Conference for the Social Activity of Women of Yugoslavia. And it basically continues its activities in a similar way. So so basically already Anti-Fascist Women Front was focusing on education, healthcare, maternity protection, modernization of household, and the later, like the League of Women's Associations and the Conference for Social Activity of Women, they continued this focus, and they were devoted to improving lives and status of women in their household, in their workplaces, and within housing communities in both urban and rural areas. And they wanted to increase women's living standard and support their stronger political and social engagement. And this is also an important element of this. And this brings us actually to this focus on household work. And since I already mentioned Yugoslav women's organizations and the Socialist Alliance of the Working People, so one of really important events that take place at the end of 1950s is the so-called Brijuni Assembly. So the Brijuni Assembly is the fifth plenum of the Socialist Alliance of the Working People, which is held in April 1957, and it was convened in the anticipation of the 7th Congress of the League of Communists of Yugoslavia, which then takes place a year later, so in April 1958 in Ljubljana. And the conclusions of the Brijuni Assembly were influential in orientating the activities of Yugoslav social organizations in the late 50s and late 60s. And basically, they were kind of taken from the already existing agenda of Yugoslav women's organizations. So what were the conclusions? So basically, they said that there was a lack of systematic state support for improving women's lives, and that this was the cause of their lagging participation in Yugoslav political and social activism. So, and what this meant, then this further decreased the societal consciousness of the new equal status of women in a socialist society. So, other words, although there were already legal measures for women to be equal citizens in Yugoslav society, they had the right to vote. Their lagging participation in political and social activism due to being overburdened by household work and wage labor at the same time was kind of enabling the general rise of this social consciousness that women are in fact equal, because the state wasn't providing them enough support. And the proposed solution was to organize social help for women and families. This meant bigger budgetary contributions to improving the personal and social living standard, ensuring the implementation of legal measures, and developing relevant infrastructure within communes and other self-managing bodies. And from the late 1950s, planning and development of these different institutions and measures to support women and families, particularly within the framework of social self-management in housing communities, was due to this decision by the Brijuni Assembly, not just the task of Yugoslav Women's Organization, but kind of on the agenda of other social organizations and expert platforms, and they would mutually collaborate, as I will show on these issues. And before I continue, I would just like to also explain a bit more what I mean by some of these concepts or some of these terms. So what do we mean by, or what did they mean at that point by household work? So household work should be really understood broadly as unpaid reproductive labor. So it includes housework, but it also includes care works or care for children and elderly. And modernization of household work includes technological development, so-called mechanization of household work, but more importantly, it also includes the socialization of household work, which should take place within housing communities. So socialization of household work refers to the transformation of private domestic work into public social work in state-provided institutions, facilities, and services. So in other words, they were advocating that household work the households should be turned into a public industry. So this meant being provided for in these different institutions and facilities. And these would include development and constructions of various relevant industrial branches, corresponding services, for example, practical and comfortable apartments, communal infrastructure, cheap and fast restaurants, a good food industry, mechanized services and workshop, organized retail favorable for women and families, industry for the production of consumer goods, and institutions for children. And all of these institutions would exist within the housing community, which was defined as the socio-economic unit assigned to govern neighborhoods. So here I just want to point out that the housing community is not a neighborhood per se, so it's not an urban unit, it's really a socio-economic unit within the broader self-management system, a social self-management system defined as the basic self-management of citizens in common affairs, so basically outside of their workplaces. And a really important part of this focus on household work was so-called educational work. And this idea of educational work and some kind of scientific basis for this solution brings us to the topic of home economics. So home economics in general is defined as the scientific study and organization of households, and it was institutionalized as a scientific discipline in the United States at the turn of the century. And women stood at the center of these concerns as educators, practitioners, and consumers of new scientific practices, spaces, and goods related to domesticity. And in this period, home economics was really strongly related to the broader movement of scientific management, particularly Taylorism, and this idea of a kind of efficient and productive way of organizing households and household work. And home economics was also related to questions of design, so design of appliances, design of homes, design of neighborhoods. And this is why home economics in this period and later on is also connected to different architectural and housing movements. So basically in the United States at the turn of the century, this idea of rational, efficient households was promoted by women and women's movements with different political visions. So they did not necessarily all have the same political or social goals. And following the First World War, home economics also appears, let's say, in Europe, again, in different contexts. So I don't know, we have the Soviet Union, Weimar Germany, but also interwar Yugoslavia. So home economics is something that exists before as a kind of discipline. And as I've mentioned, an important part of home economics is this idea of education, educational work, and what they call in this early texts like enlightenment, so domestic enlightenment, and it includes both professional education. So this means education of personnel, which would then become teachers in home economics, but also popular education for broader audiences and development of expertise. And it also includes, for this reason, institutionalization of domestic courses. So they started being offered in schools or in enterprises, and they even started opening special schools for home economics. And here on this photo, you can see it's a picture of a domestic, so it represents a domestic course for cooking and preservation of food intended for teachers in home economics. And it took place at the Center for Household Improvement in Zagreb in 1955. And this is basically one of the institutions that develop in Yugoslavia through this sphere of home economics. So these are the centers for household improvement and higher schools for home economics. The first center for household improvement was established in Ljubljana in 1954. And at the same year, they also opened the first higher school for home economics in Slovenia as well, in Groblje. And soon, like a year after, it was really followed by a great number of similar centers and schools throughout Socialist Yugoslavia. And what these institutions did, they organized domestic courses, such as this one in photo, different types of exhibitions, round tables. They even imported household appliances, for example, and different technology. They had an educational presence in the media, such as press, radio, television, and they had their own publications. So they published books and magazines. And so, for example, the Center in Household Improvement in Sarajevo and the one in Ljubljana, they had their own magazines. And here you can see, so Dobno Gospodinstvo, so it was the magazine of the Center for Household Improvement in Ljubljana. And this is a cover from 1960, which, as you see, it shows like an interior of a supermarket. And here we have a map from 1960 of all the centers and schools and departments for household improvement. And in 1960, there was 124 of these centers on different republic, federal, and county levels. So there was really a lot of them. And one other dimension of this home economics that has to be mentioned is this aspect of transnational expert of change. So home economics is a scientific discipline. Obviously, it doesn't just sort of come out of nothing. And there is really a big element of transnational expert exchange that helps developing both financially, but in terms of expert knowledge to support the centers for home economics. I would say one of the most important ones took place within the American Technical Assistance Program, which was organized by the International Cooperation Administration and the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. And basically, throughout the 1950s, they would give scholarships to women from women's organizations and from these centers to travel to different Western, Northern European, and North American countries like Norway, US, UK, Switzerland, West Germany, Belgium, etc. And they would go there and they would spend a few months to learn how to become educators and administrators in home economics. And then they would return to Yugoslavia to work in these centers. At the same time, the Food and Agriculture Organization, they also financially supported their own experts coming to Yugoslavia and having lectures and seminars. And they also financially supported the first pan-Yugoslav seminar on home economics in April, which took place in April 1956 in Belgrade. And it was visited by Margaret Hawking, who was she was leading the Department for Home Economics at the Food and Agriculture Organization. And here in the first photo, you can see, like, this is a photo from the seminar from April 1956. In addition to this Food and Agriculture Organization, there was also other types of scholarships, and Yugoslav women's organizations also joined the International Federation for Home Economics, and they participated in their seminars. At the same time, Yugoslav women's organizations would also really regularly report on what was happening in the sphere of home economics in other countries in their magazines, and they would often host other women's organizations or travel to other places. And they were particularly interested in Scandinavia because it had essentially one of the most developed and institutionalized levels of these home economics. So in Denmark, you could study home economics at the level of the university, for example. At the same time, they also had collaborations with other state socialist regimes in this period where similar processes took place. And here I would like to devote a bit more time to focus on the situation in Poland, because Yugoslav Women's Organization had the most fruitful collaboration with the Polish Liga Kobiet, so it's the Polish official women's organization, and it was really centered around the issue of household work and home economics. So basically, after the Tito-Stalin split, the Yugoslav Women's Organization didn't have any kind of contact with Liga Kobiet until 1956. And then the president of Liga Kobiet, Alicia Mushiava, she initiated a kind of rekindling of their contact, and a delegation came from Poland and visited the different Yugoslav republics. And their trip was really focused on the efforts made in household work and home economics. So they visited agriculture cooperatives in Serbia, institutions for motherhood and childcare in Croatia, and centers and school for home economics in Slovenia. And here is a photo of the Polish delegation. This in the middle, this is Alicia Mushiava. She was the president of Liga Kobiet at that moment. And here is Angela Ocepek, who was a really important Yugoslav Slovenian member of the women's organizations and communists. And basically, after this visit of the Polish delegation, the Yugoslav delegation had a return visit to Poland a few months later. And this is how they started essentially their collaboration. And they did it because Liga Kobiet had a very similar focus on improving women's living standard, improving the everyday life of Polish women. And they established the Committee for Home Economics in 1957, which was one of their later on most popular and most successful programs. And they explicitly asked Yugoslav women's organizations to help them establish this Committee for Home Economics. So the director and some journalists, they visited Socialist Yugoslavia, and Yugoslav women's organizations sent their own experts to Poland to kind of help them establish this committee. They also would send women journalists to each other to write reports on the countries. They had an exchange of their press publication. And after some years of these collaborations, in December 1961, the two women's organizations organized an international seminar for what they called representative of women's organizations from neighboring countries. It took place in Belgrade, December 1961, and it was attended by delegates from Hungary, Bulgaria, Soviet Union, and Italy. And it basically was about providing help for women in households, and included a visit to relevant institutions in several Yugoslav republics. And this is not a very good photo, but a photo essentially from this international seminar. So as I've mentioned, there were some similarities between the two organizations. So mostly this focused on everyday life and the idea of home economics as a kind of scientific framework for improving household work. The Polish Liga Kobiet, they also had a kind of sort of continuity already from the interwar period in the sphere of home economics, and they also receive financial support from UN, so from some of the Food and Agriculture Organization. They were also members of the International Federation of Home Economics. I think, and what's interesting for me, when we do compare the two organizations, you can still see that there are some differences between the two. And I think what's most different is this idea that was influential for Yugoslav women organizations of essentially the self-management system. So first of all, one was the question of decentralization of these centers. So the Polish, the Liga Kobiet basically established the Committee of Home Economics, but then they discussed how they were influenced by this decentralized way that the centers and schools operated in Yugoslavia. And soon they also opened like a bigger network of their own centers and schools and clinics throughout Poland, which followed some kind of main directives, but at the same time, they were influenced by problems in local areas. And this is something that they said was really influential for them from the Yugoslav case, because this is how this Yugoslav network functioned. That's one thing. And the other thing was that in the Yugoslav case, that in the Polish case, they were focused on improving household work as a means to kind of facilitate and combine the roles of women as workers, but also as mothers, as housemakers, etc. While in the Yugoslav case, I think this sort of relationship between paid and unpaid labor. So the idea is not to combine it; it's rather always a conflict, and the idea is simply to remove this household work in order to increase women's political and social activism. And this activism implies that women would be active in their workplaces, so in the workers' councils, but also in housing local communities and other self-governing bodies. So that basically they would strengthen their social position, but also contribute to the Yugoslav self-management system, so both in the workplace, but also social self-management. So there is much more emphasis on this political and social activism and this connection to the self-management system in their practices. Okay, so basically in the late 1950s to early 1960s, these Yugoslav women's organizations, as I mentioned already, participated and organized several exhibitions and conferences which dealt with the topics of modernization and socialization of household work within self-managed housing communities. And I want to show how also these were the places where some initial proposals and models to modernize retail and retail spaces emerged. And the context of the late 1950s. So as I mentioned already, there was this Briuni Assembly in 1957. There are several other events. So first we have the new economic 5-year plan from 1957, and then the program of the League of Communists published after the 7th Congress, which was held in April 1958 in Ljubljana. And these sort of officialized this shift to decentralized approach to economic planning, light industry, production of consumer goods, but also this idea that Yugoslav citizens have a right to acquire consumer goods and to raise their living standard. And these kind of economic changes were also related to the development of communal infrastructure and self-management systems, so both workers and social self-management. And focusing on social self-management was the central task of the Socialist Alliance of Working People, which in 1960 had around 12 million members. And so I've mentioned that they were engaged in different exhibitions, different kinds of seminars, etc. And I think the kind of strongest public, let's say, crystallization, popularization of all these topics is a series of exhibitions, events, and publications, which takes place from 1957 to 1960 at the Zagreb Fair, and it's called Family and Household. So the family and household exhibitions were organized by Yugoslav Women's Organization and the Trade Union Federation of Yugoslavia. And the organizing committee was chaired by Jožefa Pepca Kardelj. And you can see her here giving a speech at the opening of the 1957 exhibition. And she's important because she was really leading this organizational committee. And no less important is to mention that her husband was Edvard Kardej, who is also one of the main intellectualists and ideologists behind the self-management system. So these exhibitions were held at Zagreb Fair in 1957, 1958, 1960, and they were also supported by numerous other Yugoslav organizations, chambers of commerce, enterprises, centers for household improvement, etc. And they demonstrated to the wider Yugoslav audience, so in concrete terms, what are the plans and achievements in modernizing urban and rural households, establishing housing communities, improving the conditions of women and families, increasing consumption and the living standard, and strengthening social self-management. So the first exhibition had gathered around 300 exhibitors from Yugoslavia and abroad, and it had 4 major topics: the history of Yugoslav women before and after the Second World War, help for households through services institutions for children, home economics with an emphasis on nutrition, clothing, hygiene, and recreation, and a children's fair. And basically, except for this commercial aspect that in general these trade exhibitions had, the organizers also emphasized the educational and propagandistic character. So what they wanted to do was to convince Yugoslav producers and consumers into accepting the proposed institutions, spaces, objects, and methods necessary for modernizing household work. So unlike conventional trade exhibitions, the products were all taken from these different companies and they were mixed together to form complete spaces. So you would have model kitchens, model kindergartens, modern laundromats, and you would also have instructors there who demonstrated to the visitor how these spaces and objects were used, and if the objects were in prototypes, they could also sell them. And here we can see on this picture, it's one of the setups from the exhibition. I thought it was interesting because it sort of tries to show what they want to do in terms of modernizing household work. So here you see this very traditional way of washing clothes in the river, and here are some like washing machines from the 1950s. So this is this aspect of this mechanization of this household labor. At the same time, this kind of propagandistic effect went into both directions. So they also wanted to influence Yugoslav producers to produce this kind of appliances, and also consumers themselves. And what's interesting is that they conceptualized people as individual consumers, but the exhibition also proposed a new category of collective consumers, and these collective consumers were essentially housing communities. So this is also a way what the socialization of household work means, that if you're not able to individually purchase these washing machines, the housing community would purchase it collectively, and then this household work would then being performed outside of the household but within the housing community as this location where you would socialize household work. When we speak particularly about retail, at this exhibition it was still presented rather modestly, so only 5 retail enterprises participated, and they showed only 4 stores which use still the traditional retailing methods, so not the self-service supermarket system. But since feminine household exhibition was actually a bigger part of the autumn fair in 1957, there was still a chance to see this model for modern retail, but it was not provided by the Yugoslavs, it was rather provided by Americans in their pavilion. And they showcased 9,000 square meters large supermarket, which displayed around 4,000 goods. And you could walk around the aisles, touch the goods, and observe the instructors who were demonstrating how the goods were packaged and stored. And this is, this here is the brochure from the Zagreb Fair with this American supermarket. And this exposition of this American supermarket was really influential because they imported the supermarket itself and they reopened it in Belgrade in 1958. They also imported all the equipment and all the furniture needed to run the supermarket. And Yugoslav authorities planned to open 60 similar supermarkets throughout the country. And the Yugoslav women's organizations, a few months after this exhibition, they wrote a letter to the Federal Secretariat for Trading Goods to ask them, so basically they were telling them why these supermarkets were really important for resolving this household work for women and families and for improving the living standard. And they were asking them to financially support Konzum, which was a Zagreb-based retail enterprise, to open its first supermarket. And this happened soon in 1958. And this here is the interior of the first Konzum supermarket in Zagreb, which opened in 1958, which is the year where, let's say, most of these supermarkets started being opened in socialist Yugoslavia. The year after, we have the second edition of the Family and Household exhibition, again at the Zagreb Autumn Fair in 1958. And I think this exhibition brought a much clearer vision of the connection between housing communities and socialization of household work, as well as an even more, let's say, ambitious and elaborate array of products and spaces. So unlike in the previous exhibition, which I mentioned starts with the topic of history of women's history of Yugoslav women's organizations. The first topic in 1958 weren't women, but now it was the housing community. And the housing community was shown as representing a new perspective in solving the problem of relieving women of household work, and was now conceptualized as an extended family. So what does this mean? And I will read this citation from the official bulletin of the organizers. So the housing community achieves the idea of a socialist family and socialist household because it transfers certain family and household functions into the housing community. In other words, it connects the individual household with the collective, which in fact relieves the family. Economical work transferred to institutions of the community frees the family from heavy rational labor in the household, which makes difficult or even fully prevents social activity. So here we can see how the housing community represents this place of socialization of household work, because basically it takes the household work outside of the household, and then it enables let's say a bigger social and political engagement. But what we can also, so this kind of, what we can see here is also kind of change in the gendered aspect of its narrative. So it's not necessarily anymore about women, it's also about families, and it's also about the housing community as a kind of this extended type of family within the social self-management system. And I think the idea was to present household work not just as a responsibility of women, but also of the whole family, and women's issues and social issues. Whether this was really effective in the end is a matter of discussion, but I think it definitely does shows a really interesting, I would say, like gendered root of how the housing community was conceptualized as a socioeconomic unit, so that it sort of connects from these different transformations. So alongside this housing community, other sections dealt with services and institutions for children in housing communities, individual households, housing industry, and retail. So here we have the first time a really specific section on retail and industry prepared by the Yugoslav Association of Commerce Chambers and the Federal Industrial Chamber. And the goal of this section was to organize the circulation of goods between producers and consumers. So the exhibition organizers focused on showing how to synchronize retail with the needs of families and households by adjusting working hours, selling prepackaged and ready-made goods, industrially made clothing and household appliances, organizing home deliveries and repair shop, introducing the self-service system, and joining smaller shops into department stores. So here we have the self-service system, and this joining smaller shops into department stores is the kind of main elements of this modern retail. And alongside panels, photographer charts, these goals were best embodied into like the centerpieces of the exhibition, which were two life-sized and fully functional models of self-service department stores, which you can see here in the picture. This one was intended only for clothing, so it was like a fashion store. And this one was a universal department store. So we had a supermarket in the ground floor, and the first floor was intended for selling household appliances, furniture, books, toys, and goods for leisure time and vacation. In like architectural terms, the stores were prefabricated buildings made from steel, glass, aluminum, and they were built by construction companies from Krško and Mostar, and they represent really novelties in this constructional sense. They were up to 2,000 square meters big and fully furnished by equipment and furniture necessary for self-service stores. Because, I mean, although to us today, self-service stores are something so everyday, at that point, it's not just that you need this building, but you also need all the equipment that would enable you to use the self-service store. For example, you need refrigerators for holding all this prepackaged food, you need cashiers, etc., etc. And all this equipment at that point wasn't being produced by Yugoslavia, so it was all imported from Italy. At the same time, they were selling real consumer goods in the stores, and all of these were products of Yugoslav industry. So I think these model stores, they have a specific function that they're exhibits themselves. They're also exhibition spaces for this furniture and this consumer goods, but they're also functional retail spaces because you could really use them. And the idea of showing these stores as they really are So the bigger idea was to basically change the habits of Yugoslav consumers and get them accustomed to this new self-service system. And in this way, to increase the number of consumers, to increase the number of sold consumer goods, and to stimulate industry to produce the consumer goods in a quality matter. And they also conducted a questionnaire during the exhibition to ask the consumers what they thought. But to be fair, although they had this kind of feedback process, they were already pretty clear in what they wanted to do and how they wanted to like change the habits of these consumers. And these stores are important because basically they set the standards. So in terms of construction and appearance, concentration of different products in one space, which was also kind of new, and the use of self-service system and its accompanying equipment, furniture, and goods. So basically this sets the developmental trajectory of department of supermarkets and self-service department stores. So from the late 50s to 60s, and onwards. And in April 1960, we have the final edition of the Family and Household exhibition, this time at the Spring Fair. So 1 year earlier, there wasn't an exhibition, but there was a series of events and publications called Month of Family and Household, and they take place throughout the country. So for example, in Zagreb, the women's organizations organized the roundtable on issue of retail and consumers. But this series of events is important because basically it moves the focus only from Zagreb to organize different kinds of events throughout whole Yugoslavia, and then they also continue after 1960s when the exhibition is over, and they kind of signal how the future of these exhibitions will look like. The exhibition itself had 9 parts: housing community, department of family and household. Department of family and household is basically centers for household improvement, but because at that point home economics became a subject at workers and people's universities, it also signals a kind of a change in this level of institutionalization. Then modern housing services, institutions for children, social nutrition, retail, rest and recreation, and rural households. And this is actually the first time that there is a really specific focus on rural households, because everything before was really about urban households. And another specificity of the 1960 exhibition, so as I mentioned before, the exhibitions would also have models, prototypes, important goods, but the 1960 exhibition it showed already mainly existing neighborhoods, so housing communities, furniture and appliances which were made in Yugoslavia. And the section on modern retail and supplied, which was prepared by Croatian and Zagreb Chambers of Commerce, had 5 parts. Introduction, where they discussed the problems of the retail sector. Then they had an exhibition of all Yugoslav-made equipment and appliances. So now they were made already by the Yugoslav industry. A big supermarket with goods, which you can see here on the photos. They had a fashion store and a shoe store. So basically, unlike 1958, here they didn't necessarily bring anything new in terms of the retailing system and technology, but they rather reflected on the development so far and reaffirmed this need to spread self-service stores in Yugoslavia. And the reason for this is basically that the self-service system as a modern retailing system was thought to be the most economically best system for modernizing retail. The economic advantages of modern retail were important on a larger scale for Yugoslav economy, but they were also important on a smaller scale because they were thought that retail was the main economic branch of the housing community. So modern retail in the housing community was a crucial element in raising the living standard of the housing community. And at the same time, it was also envisioned at that point that retail spaces would be run by self-managed bodies of citizens in housing communities, which doesn't actually happen later at all. At the same time, the self-service system, with its efficient and participatory character, also played an important role in transferring household work from individual person or family to the entire self-governing community without additional assistance or waste of time and money. So it's also one of the facilities necessary for socializing household work. So it's strengthening basically the housing community and social self-management. And these were all these kinds of ideas that existed at this point. And this brings me to some of the last points that I want to say in this presentation. And that's basically the question, so what happens then afterwards? So when we speak about retail, as I've mentioned, the standards for how modern retail and how modernization of retail look like in the 1960s through self-service supermarkets and department stores is already set during these exhibitions. As I've mentioned, the American Pavilion from 1957 is reopened a year later in Belgrade. The two the two department store models from the 1958 exhibition, they were opened in Zagreb in 1960. And here we can see the Universal Department Store, which was opened as a NAMA department store in Trešnjevka in Zagreb. And it was the first self-service department store in Zagreb, and it exists and works even today. Basically all this equipment was imported. The Yugoslav industry started producing its own equipment. It also started producing this kind of prepackaged goods, ready-made goods that you need to sell. And they fulfilled the plan of building 60 supermarkets from 1958 to 1960. And in 1960, they had a plan to build 60 more. So basically we have also the emergence of these first supermarkets in this retail system. But at the same time, this topic of modern retail basically is not anymore a concern of these Yugoslav women's organizations. So what happens with all of these different entities? So first of all, we have the Family and Household Exhibition and the organizational committee, which was led by Pevca Kardelj. It's also officialized in a way and becomes the Federal Committee for Family and Household. And it's active from 1960 until 1990. So the exhibition was the last one, but they continued different actions and a couple of collaborations, which were dispersed throughout the Yugoslav space. And they also published their bulletins on family and household, and then on housing community, or in 63, it's renamed into local community. So they were basically really focused on local communities and developing this social self-management and all of its changes. And they also had a particular interest in consumers. So basically, as I mentioned, there was one of the interests of Yugoslav women's organizations, although they were interested in women as workers, they were interested more in women as consumers. And the focus on women as consumers sort of generally becomes a focus on consumers in general, so their rights and their status. And consumer councils and some kind of regulating bodies are also established as a part of the social self-management system. And these committees for family household, they were also focused on the issue of consumer councils and consumption from this kind of side. Then we have the Centers for Household Improvement, and basically I'm not completely sure what happens to all of them, but they are kind of fused with other institutions. So in 1963, the Center for Household Improvement in Zagreb merges with the Center for Facilities of Social Standards, and this center took care of all facilities and infrastructure needed for raising the social standard and socializing household work. So see, basically their tasks were very similar, so they fuse. But I think this is somehow also connected to this in general change of moving from women to family to housing communities, so that there is this bigger idea of the social problems. And for this reason, I mean, women's organizations, they are still focused on some of these topics from before, but this idea of housework, services, retail, etc., it's put aside. It's not under their jurisdiction anymore, and they really focus on issues of care work. So in the 70s and 80s, they focused on things like motherhood, family planning, institutions for children, so on social welfare and health, and not necessarily on these retail topics. And I think, I don't know, I would conclude by saying that I think one of the main reasons for this is that actually from the very beginning, there is a tension between individual and collective consumption. So we have individual consumption, mechanization of households, but they're saying the whole time, yes, it's not the point to have a lot of washing machines, but to socialize household work. So that is this main idea, and to use this collective consumption within these housing communities. But as the economic agendas of Yugoslavia change, especially after the economic reform in 1965, and as the economic conditions change, individual consumption essentially prevails over collective consumption. So as long as you are able, so when Yugoslavia produces for example, when Yugoslavia produces washing machines and you are able to afford to buy them in your own household, you are more likely to do that than to use a laundromat. I think Polona Sitar shows this really well in her book From Another Angle, where she interviews people who were taking part in these events. But I think when we look at it from another side, it's hard to promote collective consumption and socialization of household work if on the other hand you are like the state or this broader economic system kind of allows for more individual consumption in producing and buying these appliances, and women's organizations then focus really more on social welfare and health, and not necessarily on these issues of retail, which are then parts of really enterprises as some kind of business entities, and not anymore connected to housing communities in this initial sense. And this is where I would end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Ivana, very much for this very rich presentation. I really liked, and I think you broaden our way of understanding of home economics. I never thought about it, how to think it so widely, and I think it's very good that you related it to this production of knowledge. So we have to think about development of different kinds of expertise, and that broadens our way of thinking and looking back on how modern retail was developing in these early socialist years. I think it's very important also this international collaboration emphasis that you put, which kind of, in this way, it's important to think everyday life of also socialist self-management system. I have some questions prepared, but first I would like to open the floor to you, to our public. Please.
Okay.
Yes, please.
Thank you, Ivana, for a beautiful presentation. I have a question that connects to the topic which you finished, actually, your presentation, and that is the way and how to approach the socialization of domestic labor. So you've focused here on department stores, retail, and so on. So I would put this on the one side of the continuum where we have market mediation of socialization of domestic labor, and on the other hand, we get societal plans or pure form. But I would say that generally there are different approaches to the question of socialization of domestic labor, and Yugoslavia is certainly not isolated in this regard. And I want to ask if you're familiar with any broader theoretical discussions, perhaps informing either expert groups or women's organizations in how to approach the socialization of domestic labor, and is the question of using the market forces for this instance, could this be somehow in conflict with the stated goals of a socialist society, so to say? What comes to my mind is, for instance, the Italian feminists of Fortunati, Costa, the question of should perhaps the domestic labor be unpaid domestic labor be in fact paid, right? So this was one of the solutions that existed as a potential. So just like a broad question of were Yugoslav women's organizations somehow part of these discussions, or were they influenced by those discussions?
Okay, yes. Thanks, madam, for this question. Yes, that's a really good question. I mean, they had okay, when we speak about socialization of household work, as I've mentioned, when this home economics develops already in the US and then in the interwar period in Europe, as I said, it's promoted by women's movements of different political visions. So we also have sort of more conservative visions, and we could say more progressive visions. And this idea of socialization of household work, obviously, it's not something that they came with first, and it's kind of continues this tendency of this kind of socialist or social democratic or communist idea of what to do actually with household work through its socializations. And Yugoslav women's organizations, they had broader discussions, which you can read mostly, for example, in their magazines or during their conferences, etc. So on the one hand, they had a more, let's say, like intellectual or political history particularly through Engels and through this idea how to resolve household work and improve the lives of women in particular through this idea of socialization of household work. And then what they wanted to do themselves is then how to connect it to the self-management system, to social self-management, to housing communities. And very often they had issues because they would argue that it's really hard for them because they felt they need to come up totally new with some of the solutions, because there was this general idea of socialization of household work, but they wanted to make it more concrete in their own system by connecting it to this whole framework of self-management, which wasn't just for me, I think it's not just a practical framework, but it's also a framework of thought. So how to think through this system to sort of develop it and contribute to it and to bring these things two things together. And I would say that, I mean, in this initial visions, I think there wasn't really some kind of consideration of market forces, because the idea is still that everything exists within this housing communities and within these self-governing bodies, and that the money doesn't, so if you build a new retail store, it's not that necessarily it will be paid for through the profits of some enterprise, but it would be paid for by the city and simply taken over by an enterprise, because the enterprise has the expertise and the professional personnel to do it. The same, for example, with this laundromats or with other services. So idea was that in the beginning you would probably have to hire, and they did hire, assistants who would work in this, let's say, laundromats or repair stores or etc. But they would be paid for by the housing communities. And like in time, I think their kind of vision was, and it kind of goes through this whole withering away of the state, is that you would do it all by yourself. So you wouldn't necessarily need this hired help. But I have to say they were very conscious in the sense that they didn't want to have any kind of volunteers or anyone, but they wanted to like really be able to pay for the people who did have to work in the services. But everything, so they would get their paychecks, and people who would use the services would also kind of remunerate them financially, but it was all sort of just supposed to be very modest, very kind of symbolic. So I think this idea of this market forces is really like not taken into consideration in this way. And I think it also then contributes to what I said about like this conflict between individual and collective consumption, because after 1965, for example, so when the first supermarket is, so okay, I mentioned this supermarket opened in Trešnjevka. It was financed by the People's Committee of Zagreb, so they paid for it, and they decided to give it to Nama, the department store chain, because it had the most expertise and it was the biggest chain at that point. But after 1965, it was expected of Nama, if they wanted to have new supermarket or new department stores, they had to pay it themselves from their profits, which was then very problematic for them because they didn't have enough profits to be able to build something by their own money. And I think then it just kind of enables this socialization.
Yes, Karin, we have some questions on Zoom.
We have two questions via Zoom. The first one is from Alexander Berlek-Slacek, and it goes, "Thank you for the great presentation. My question is, to what degree did the Yugoslav Women's Organization attempt to challenge the gendered division of labor within the family and the association of the household labor with women? It seems the solution to the double burden, modernization, shifting part of household work to the community, avoided demanding that men take one part of household work."
Okay, thanks for this question. Yes, I mean that's a very good question, and it has to also be said that basically behind the scenes, so during their meetings, the women's organizations, so from the very beginning, they also weren't, I mean, they were convinced in the fact that this double burden of household work was a problem that needs to be resolved, but they also weren't completely, they didn't like fully on completely decide how to do it. And they had many discussions, and the discussions I think really continue on. And they were saying that on the one hand, if we focus, if we have this home economics, if we have the centers for household work, and we are offering all of these things only to women, aren't we only reinforcing the idea that housework is essentially women's work? So this was one of the questions, but the other question was, okay, but if we completely ignore that women are the ones mostly responsible for housework and not for household work and not families per se, or both partners, then doesn't this also kind of then ignore the fact that it should be actually provided for women and not necessarily for men. I mean, I think the domestic courses themselves, they were not only open for women, so they were open for the public. And I think on one of these photos of the seminars, you do see men. So men were also involved in the work of the centers and in the audiences, but primarily it did kind of, I think all of the participants were sort of women, and there is always like this conflict whether it's better to just focus on women or whether it isn't. And it's the same as I mentioned in 1958 when they talk about the housing community rather than women. So they also really had arguments in this organizing committee, because some of the members of the committee, including actually Pevca Karadelj herself, they were saying women's equality, it's like already a thing, we don't need to talk about it anymore. It's not just about improving women, it's about if you improve women, you improve the family, you improve the whole society, and we need to talk about families and societies in order to show how these issues aren't just a niche compartmentalized issues of women, but they're issues of Yugoslavia as a whole. And some other members of these organizations were saying, yes, but they do primarily affect women and not really men. So they still kind of had these debates. And I think this whole idea to kind of show that women's issues are social issue is why they kind of gave up on having any specific gendered approach. So instead of saying, yes, it's not just that women should do household work, men should also do household work. So for them, it was just, family, like household work is a responsibility of family as a whole. And this is kind of, I think, how they try to move away from this, like two specific gender narratives in order to show that this is just a bigger social problem relevant for everyone.
Sorry, is there another? Yes.
Another one. We have one more, and the second one is from Jana Javornik. It goes, thank you for this highly relevant presentation. I could have missed this in Ivana's presentation, but my question would be whether and how Yugoslavia differed in women's activism, and especially in the role around maternal and parental rights, including in designing parental leave and public nurseries. Thank you.
Yeah, so this is another good question, but unfortunately I will have to disappoint because I don't know how to actually answer this question, because so as I've said, like during the 50s, early 60s, they had this broader focus on household work, so housework, care work, and definitely institutions for children and kindergarten and institutions for motherhoods. And this is connected to what you mentioned as women and parental right, maternity leaves, etc., etc. So this is something that's also very important for them. But since my main consideration is retail, I was always more focused on how women's organizations themselves dealt with services and retails and these more kind of commercial spaces, and not necessarily welfare institutions themselves. But this is, of course, like a big part of what women's organizations are doing. And especially after, let's say, the mid-60s and 70s and 80s, this is, I think, one of their main topics, as I said, family planning and similar kinds of activities. So from my own work, I don't think I would be able to give any specific answers what they actually did or how they would even compare to other state socialist women's organizations. But I would also say that I think this is still a topic that is, as I've said, is still under research, and it's also something that there, like, some projects could do it, and I think they will. So.
Okay,
Thank
so Jana says, fair comment, appreciate it, thank you, and she has another question.
Okay, I see.
Okay.
So it goes, there was quite some knowledge exchange also between Sweden and Slovenia. The former presented gender equality on its own, whereas Slovenia, Yugoslavia conceptualized gender equality through financial autonomy, gainful economic activity. Have you studied the two countries' practice, and would you be able to provide any insight into the country policy learning between the two? Ivana Mihaela and Vida Tomšić and their exchange during the UN conference in the 1970s?
Yes. So okay. So basically, Yugoslav women's organizations. I could not comment on the exact exchange between Vida Tomšić in 1970s. I guess you mean 1975, but basically Yugoslav women's organizations did have an interest in Scandinavian countries already in the 50s and the 60s, and what they were particularly interested in was basically how home economics, so how these centers, how schools for household improvement were organized and what the lessons were. And they really, I think, so this Food and Agriculture organization, they also supported stipends to go to the Netherlands, Denmark, and I think also Sweden. And for example, Pepca Karel herself went, I think, to Sweden, if I remember well. But anyway, so they would go there and they would spend some time there, and they would write reports and articles in these magazines of Yugoslav's women's organization. And when it comes to gender equality, so yes, I mean, you're totally right in the sense that gender equality for Yugoslav women's organizations is conceptualized through this kind of Marxist, communist framework, that if if you have economic independence, that this is something that provides, and if you're able to participate in wage labor, and this participation in wage labor is like the essence. And Vida Tomšić herself writes numerous texts about it all from 1950s, and actually Vida Tomšić herself, so she wasn't maybe so practically active in all of these centers, but in these women's magazines and in their meetings, she would have these kinds of like bigger, let's say, expositions about what is this kind of political thought, what is this intellectual, ideological framework behind what they're doing. And it's always emphasized that participation in wage labor and this economic independence is what is the basis of this gender independence. But at the same time, it's not enough to just be in like the state socialist system. It's not enough to just have that, but you have to actively participate to change the social context and to change what they say, this kind of cultural context or like mentality, which they recognize was still very much patriarchal. And you have to fight against this idea that women are like naturally predisposed to do household work, or that this division of labor is somehow very strong and you cannot change it. So you need to be active alongside this general kind of participation in wage labor.
Thank you, Ivana. So we move to another question, yes, please.
Thank you very much for the presentation, Ivana. I also love the pictures in the presentation. I have a question that is a little bit on the imagination of consumption. It's maybe a little bit trivial, but I would be interested if you have found anything on the relationship between these experts who are thinking about consumption in these supermarkets and department stores, and any existing already structures, maybe urban structures or open markets, or what we would today maybe call farmers markets. So was there anything, how were they imagined, were they in conflict, was there any competition, or how did they think about these spaces?
Great, thanks, Alex. I mean, I think I could answer this question, maybe not necessarily for what I was talking today about, because, okay, as I said, so the Yugoslav women's organizations, what I want to show is how they indirectly created this framework where you would think about how to modernize retail and how to create all these retail spaces. And what happens in the late 50s and early 60s is that these people who work, for example, for the chambers of commerce or for retail enterprises, or who even work in people's committees in different neighborhoods or in cities, they're also discussing what kind of retail spaces to open, what would be the best retail spaces. And what they were actually promoting back then was that we need to kind of move away actually from open green markets, because they represent this kind of traditional unhygienic way of buying products, like it's all dirty and everyone is there, whatever. So you don't need that. You need to have pre-packaged good, which is already weighted, it's already like packed, it's put in these refrigerators, it's very clean, and you go into a supermarket and you buy everything that's already nicely packed. And actually this supermarket, like this department store that I showed in Trešnevka, so actually the supermarket was built on the central square, and right across it there is a green market, which still exists today, but their initial idea was that they would build it across the green market to in time close the green market and to basically move all of this into the supermarket. Obviously this doesn't happen and you still have both things existing, but at that point, I mean, I think they recognized that green markets was still really preferred by some of the big parts of the population, and that you need to take them into consideration and still work with them. But ideally, like the vision for the future is that you simply wouldn't have them anymore, because the supermarket and everything being prepackaged and like pre-ready made, that this is kind of more ideal, like more modern and more convenient actually for this idea of this cultured trade and this kind of increasing this level of consumption.
Thank you. Yes, please, Isidora. Sorry, I have to wait for the microphone. It's fine. Okay.
Thanks a lot, Ivana. This was really amazing, and especially, I mean, also this discussion afterwards. I have a very short question about the rural household communities. I wonder if you could say something more about it. You just mentioned for the 1960 exhibition, and I'm not sure if there's something more to say, but I'm just curious.
Yeah, I mean, there is definitely more to say about rural households, which I kind of didn't focus on so much, but basically, so in the work of these centers for home economics and the women's organization, I think the main division like the main typography of households, it's urban and rural households, and they're kind of thinking that you need different types of, let's say, activities and different kind of engagement, or these households have different kinds of concerns, and then they need to have different kinds of like models sort of proposed to them. So basically, although 1960 is the first time that rural households appear in the exhibition itself, women's organizations and these centers were already from the beginning, from late 1940s, really active also in rural areas in the countryside. Perhaps even more so because to them, so as I've said, like one part of it is kind of changing this sort of material aspects of having these new like services and new spaces and building new facilities, etc. And then on the one hand, there's also this work on like changing how people perceive division of labor within households and whose task it is to do any of these things. And I think they consider that in the countryside, perhaps the division of labor within the household was different because there wasn't such a strict a separation between wage labor, like you go, I don't know, to your enterprise and then you return home and you work in your household. But agricultural work is already a bit more closely connected to work done inside the household. So it's kind of different how this division functions. But at the same time, they also thought that people or women who live in the countryside are more traditional, more, let's say, rigid or unwilling to kind of change and accept these modern proposals. But they also wouldn't modern proposals, and they actually they needed to be more active in the spaces where they thought that people would be more resistant to change. But they did really, I think they adapted the prototype. So for example, in this 1960 exhibition, you have also like how would a store look like in a rural, like in some village. And of course, it's not the same type of supermarket as it is for an urban setting. And they were having these considerations. And I think also it would be, I think it would also be good to do this kind of research because, as I mentioned, like they had this really decentralized network, both the women's organizations, like their branches, and also the centers. And I have only focused, for example, on primary sources from, like the federal level and from republic capitals. But if you would maybe find like primary sources from some other areas which were more rural back then, you could see what they were focusing on. And I'm thinking about how actually the director of this committee for home economics from Poland, she visited Banja Luka and she went to their center for home economics. And she said, yes, this is also like a very rural area. area, and she was talking about, for example, what specifically they were focusing on that helps like women who live in this like rural areas. So I think there is a difference. It just then would probably need to be researched like in a different way, also considering the primary sources, for example.
Thank you, Ivana. We have some more questions, comments. Yes, please. Oh wait, we need to get the microphone closer.
Thank you very much for the lectures. The lecture was great, and it opened so many questions. And one of the questions I was thinking on, you were discussing, especially in the late 50s, this idea that some housework should be done differently from maybe outside. Is this connected also with architecture or urbanism at the time? I don't know. This idea that maybe also for having good support regarding food preparations or maybe restaurants in the, because I just said in certain, there was certain, I don't know when exactly, but a period when the kitchens were very small due to the fact that maybe they had this idea that most of the meals would be eaten outside, some kind of collective way. If you have anything about that, how were women organization connected to those ideas, and if were their ideas or they came from other source? Maybe just a little bit about that. Thank you.
Yeah, great. So this is a great question. So I think, yeah, it's really important to, I think, emphasize here how these home economics and how these changes that they wanted to make are really related to questions of design. So both like urban design, how you would design a housing community, for example, in the sense of how it would like fit in this new construction plans in Yugoslavia, but also how you would design different facilities in the communities, and how you would design apartments, and how you would design individual rooms in apartments. For example, kitchens, which were really relevant also for Yugoslav women's organizations. So actually, and this is one of the things that I've mentioned, so these organizations were really promoting this idea of, let's say, I mean, we would call it like interdisciplinarity, so that it's not just, so it's not that the Centers for Household Improvement is just, you know, everyone employed is just from women's organizations, but they wanted to employ experts from different fields, and they did. So they would also employ architects and some kind of urban planners, or designers, and they would like discuss these issues with them. And the same thing is with this family and household exhibitions from the late 50s, early 60s. So basically here, like, they had a group of architects and designers who designed the whole exhibition and who were also designing specific parts. So I said some of the topics were about housing. So for example, in the 1958 exhibition, we have how is it called? Like something, so it was like an apartment setting designed by Bernardo Bernardi, who is like a famous Croatian Yugoslav designer, and he designed like this new apartment of the future, of how they envisioned this apartment to look like. So there was also, and it was obviously inspired by all of this kind of like modernist, very functional design, so there is a kind of collaboration between the Yugoslav women's organizations and these architects and designers. So usually the organizations themselves, because they were like transnationally active, they would also like use these different models and sort of discuss them in their meetings, in their publications. I remember like there is one article in one of the magazines called Kitchen of the Atomic Age, and they show this like late 1950s kitchen from the United States, how it looks like, etc. And they were like providing also a lot of this theoretical knowledge and a lot of instructions to architects and urban planners. But I have to say they were also, I'm not sure how smooth this cooperation was, because I read some of discussions during the meetings where they like the members of the women's organizations were a bit angry at the architects because they were trying to tell them that it should look like this and this, and they were kind of promoting their own vision, which the women thought was a bit too, let's say, like megalomaniac for the level of like, for the purchasing power etc. So they were thinking, yes, you need to kind of modernize these spaces, but not in a way that these people won't be able to afford them or won't even want them because it's just like too much for them right now. So they were also having kind of like conflicts here. But yeah, it's definitely connected, and it's really, really thought about. Also in the case of retail, so in 1957 in the exhibition, they had a big model of what they thought would be ideal housing community. And it's really like in the center is a retail space, and there are services placed throughout apartment buildings in a way that makes them like really, so you can really easily reach them in the most fast way. So it's not like, it's really thought through also through this, I think, framework of housing communities. So
thank you. We have some more questions, comments. I have then one question, or maybe two. I'm interested in differences between former republics of Yugoslavia, differences regarding emphasis, focus, maybe. And another question is that you mentioned magazines, but also you showed Sodobno Gospodinstvo magazine. Like, who did the magazine target? Who were the readers? How many readers were they? I mean, did they target experts or like normal everyday women? And maybe also, did they offer practical advices, something that women needed? Because I guess it was, for many people, it was shock moving from rural areas to urban centers with industrialization, and moving away from like bigger families to like forming nuclear families. So maybe Sodobno Gospodinstvo or some other magazines try to help them, people in need.
Okay, so first, this difference between former republics. It's hard to say, but I think already here you could have noticed, for example, that a lot of things were happening in Slovenia rather than somewhere else. And this is also connected, I think, to how active were particular republic branches of the women's organizations. Because due to this decentralization, the federal level basically consisted of delegates from members who existed on this republic level. And there wasn't, so after, for example, the Anti-Fascist Women Front changes into this League of Women's Associations, there isn't a directive, okay, now you have to have a women's organization here, 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 and here. No, it's kind of led to the activists who already exist in some areas to form their own association. And this is why sometimes it happens like immediately, so they simply change their name. Sometimes the Anti-Fascist Women's Front committees would close down in some areas and they didn't reopen, or it took some time for them to reopen. And basically this caused a kind of imbalance into how active were women's organizations in different republics. So the most active ones were in Slovenia and in Croatia and then in Serbia, but in comparisons, the ones, I don't know, in like Montenegro, Macedonia, or Bosnia and Herzegovina, they were really not active at all. I mean, not active at all, but they were not as active. And the other kind of issue is also how to even research them, because, for example, when you go to the archives of Yugoslavia and they have this federal collection of women's organizations, you can see there's like a box for the Slovenian organization. It's like this big, but then the Montenegro one, it's like a few papers. So they also didn't even produce as much as of this primary source material. And since women's organizations aren't really my main topic, I wasn't able to see, you know, like go to Republic archives and really look at their papers. Although I know, for example, in Sarajevo, it's really hard even to look at or to find the papers of this Bosnian and Herzegovinian section. So it's hard to make like really concrete conclusions here. But yes, basically some women's organizations were much more active than others. And then this is, I think, what like causes different kind of, it's like this level of these activities. Although when you look at this map of the centers and school for household improvement, you could see that they really existed like everywhere. But I couldn't say what all of them were, for example, doing, or what they were particularly focusing on. But I would say, I guess, in this kind of leading when you have these leading events or congresses or this transnational exchange, etc., you could see there is a bigger predominance, for example, of Slovenian or Croatian protagonists and women from other organizations. And then when it comes to their magazines, so I think when we speak about the magazines of the centers for household improvement, like Sodobno gospodinstvo or Domaćinstvo was the one from Sarajevo, I think they were really more expert targeted. I mean, they didn't like Sodobno gospodinstvo. It was being published for like 5 years, and I think it was really intended more for experts and for people who were interested in this field of health economics and what the centers were doing. But Yugoslav women's organizations, they had their own magazines, and they really had a lot of them. So there was like a federal level magazine, and then republics had their own magazines, like in Slovenia with Naša žena, and in Croatia it was Žena borbi and then Žena, and they were really, I think, intended for a much wider audience. And you've mentioned this practical advice. So yes, these magazines also had practical advice, for example, how to I don't know, like preserve food in jars, like how to make this zimnica, how to like tailor your own clothes, etc., etc. But I mean, I think the women's organizations and these editorial boards, they also had a conflict with this kind of practical advice, because they thought that, yes, on the one hand, it's useful, but then on the other hand, again, it kind of seems as if women need to do these things, but that's against the broader message that they were sending, that it should be socialized. And it's not that women should necessarily do this zimnica, but it should be in this like provided by the housing communities, actually. So they were kind of having conflicts with this practical advice, but it does exist, and you can find it, of course, in this magazine.
Well, thank you very much. So if we don't have any further questions and comments, I would like to thank Ivana once again for this wonderful lecture and also discussion that you led. It was amazing. I would like to thank you all for participating and posing questions. So thank you very much.